Good day, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Savage Pastron. It's French. We're French now. Um, I hope everyone's having a
Uh-huh.
grand day. We don't have Bro. Like he said, he wasn't going to be here today. He had some
Mhm.
appointments he needs to get to, so he is out. Um, he'll be kind of missed. I'm just kidding. He will be missed.
Kind.
Today, we shall be tackling a very huge, not necessarily a pew pew bang bang bomb war, but it is a
Per
war
se.
nonetheless. So
Mhm.
this is the Cold War. I think the
Ongoing,
actual
would you say?
contention lasted like 44 years or something like that. Is that right?
It began in 1947 and didn't end until 91. So it
Yeah,
was a
so
long
44
time.
years. Yeah, 44 9 months or some long time. Love them long time.
Long time.
It spanned quite a few United States presidencies.
Mhm.
And not a single one of
10
them could
of
really
them.
bring it to an end until the final guy that did it. And who's that guy again? Who's that
Well,
white guy?
technically, I would say it was Reagan, but they say officially it's under Bush.
No,
So
no, it was Reagan. It was Reagan. Reagan did it. I'm not
yeah.
giving Bush no credit for that. Bush-
I mean, he literally came in at the end of it. It was like 2 months
Yeah.
into his presidency. It doesn't really count.
It
It's like
don't
saying Biden was, would be responsible for, I don't know. Same thing, I guess. Like after Trump did it.
Yeah, yeah.
Riding the
let's give it-
coattails.
we are going
Yeah.
to give it to Reagan. We're not giving it to Bush. Reagan might not have been the most exquisite president, but he was planets better than Bush.
Yeah.
Exponentially better.
Hmm.
So we're going to discuss it. We're going to hand off the initial conversation to Mr. Information himself, the bearded wonder, Captain Cap Coy.
Yeah, Captain Cap.
Yeah, Captain Cap Coy, and then we'll we'll interchange them and Mr. Ching Chong Chinese Lee.
The
right,
discount communist looking guy.
Yeah, the North Vietnamese or
Wish
the
list
North-
Kim Jong
Korean.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what
Yes,
you get when you
wish-
come to my house. It's
wish
North
list
Korean,
Bruce Lee.
motherfucker.
Discount Kim Jong Un.
There you go. Discount KJ. Discount KJU right here. That's me.
Yeah.
so
I guess it kind of kicked us off. It's
Sorry.
the Cold War pretty much came about because of the end of the Second World War, obviously. But to kind of begin the whole situation, the reason we are dealing with communism in the first place is because of the First World War. Like everything that happens in the first half of the 20th century pretty much is what sets up everything for what we're dealing with now, right? So like one of the people very important to this would be the Dulles brothers, which had their hands in everything from the Treaty of Versailles all the way up to MK Ultra, right? These guys were in dirty, dirty things, and this is the reason we've had to deal with all this nonsense is because of what they were up to. So it wasn't until Dulles got kicked out of the CIA and led to the Kennedy assassination do we see that kind of things didn't really turn around, but it just cemented what the CIA became during the Cold War. That's really what you really have to focus on in the Cold War is what the CIA was doing this entire time, right? So one of the things that led us into this point is the fact that the Germans sent Lenin to Russia to start a revolution, which sounds familiar. How do you start a coup? You send a revolutionary to go start a revolution in order to kick them off the board. And that's what they did. And then you should know your history of Russia. Lenin comes to power. He takes over. Then he kills over in 1924, right? And then Stalin comes into power. And then that's who we have to deal with up until a certain point. And then after Stalin, who's the other guy? That doesn't matter. Whoever that other guy was. But anyway, basically it leads down this whole regime of them wanting buffer states. So you have all of the Eastern Europe being taken over after the Second World War by Stalin, and then also the other Soviet states in the East. And then you have China becoming communist with their takeover, and then them getting the Republic of China being kicked out to Taiwan, and that's why Taiwan is the way it is right now. It's because that was the legitimate government that was kicked out the communist revolutionaries back in the 1920s.
Malenkov.
Yeah.
That's the guy you're talking about.
That's what it's like. Yeah. So basically, every person after Stalin kept trying to de-Stalinize Russia, but they really failed at doing it every single time because, like, how do you keep the Soviet states together? You have to keep it with an iron fist. You don't get to have freedom until towards the end of the Soviet era, and that's when everything falls apart. They knew it would fall apart as soon as they let go. And so that was the big kind of push, is keeping communism out of our backyard. At least that was what we were officially told, is we were trying to keep communism out of America, out of the states. And what it really boils down to is that the Cold War was about cementing who was leading the next world order after World War II, right? So during this time, you have the liberal economic order, which is us and our allies, and then you have the Soviet order and the communist order on the other side. And that's what this fight is really about, is cementing who's going to be the top dog. And as we all know in history, we came out on top and we led the charge on that. But the problem is, was it good? And the cost that we paid for that, was it worth it? Is a big question.
I don't believe it was, but I mean, we'll dive a whole lot deeper into exactly what it really yielded, and really whether or not we actually defeated communism or just adopted it.
No.
I have a suspicion it was the latter. What did you manage to procure on the war, sir Lee? The General Lee. I'm gonna call you General Lee from now on.
Oh, jeez. That's gonna be. I'm gonna see a lot of stolen valid comments coming my way.
That's funny. That's good though.
But as far as I'm aware, with the Cold War, this was the actual big. This is where we come to understand the reality of the military-industrial complex. I mean, talk about nuclear arms race. Who was going to be the first to amass as many nuclear arms as possible between the United States and the USSR at the time, and just, I mean, if we're talking CIA, you know about espionage and you know about subversion tactics with inside nation states, and the CIA has had their hand in a lot of governmental subversion, and so you're trying to one up each other in terms of arms race, dealings with the other side, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type philosophy. And then all in all, all the while keeping your citizens at bay with, oh, there's nothing going on, guys. No Cold War going on. Yeah, no, Cuba doesn't have anything in their backyard. Don't worry about that. We're good. We're safe. We're America. Don't worry about this type of stuff.
So when we look at, well, it's an extensive, like what you were saying, or it's an extensive period of time. And if we were to go into details of the entire era, we would be here for at least a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
there is that much info to cover. But because we're trying to tackle this from the aspect of what these wars did for American policy, did to the American people by proxy, and also accomplished on the world stage for America, I think the other part that we're going to talk about too is how the Cold War shaped the UN. Because you had a conglomerate of people that had I won't say the best interest, just the interest of the world on their mind. They had no intentions of really having sovereign nations. They wanted to have everyone. And this is my theory. I think they were just wanting to try and make it an advanced form of the USSR. They couldn't have the USSR being the only one doing what they were doing. So they had to have, because tell me what the UN actually does. They don't, I mean, what do they actually do to secure sovereign nations?
They don't. I mean, initially it was supposed to, here's the idea. The League of Nations and the United Nations was originally meant to stop world wars, right? That was the whole ideology behind it, was to keep other nations from fighting each other in a massive battle like we did in the first two, right? So it's supposed to be an arbitration system between nations, just like you would have the court system, the federal court system in the United States. That is essentially what the UN was supposed to be, except that it doesn't actually have any power and it can't enforce any of its rules. So therefore, it's just a finger wagging organization that says, "Hey, you can't do that," and then they do it anyway.
Mm-hmm. So we have now, once the Cold War came to an end, and the new regime of Bush came in. Now this is where I think this is the real reason I wanted the Cold War to get tackled. I don't think they really wanted the Cold War to end necessarily. I just think they wanted it to transition. I think they needed a transition point, because it took them this long to say you need to stop, but for what purpose and how did they do it? We know it's by coercion, but at the same time, all the UN did at that point was continue on the exact same mindset that Lenin and every other regime that was dealing with the USSR did. You control the masses by policy. You put a overall law in place that governed everyone the same, but it's not. The real power lay with the ones instituting the laws, and if you tried to fight back against the laws, you were sanctioned. Okay, except that with the USSR, it was punishment, is what they call it, but with the UN, it's called sanctions. Now, to have a sovereign nation, what exactly can a conglomerate tell that sovereign nation they can and cannot do? I don't know whether or not the UN actually protects that, or if they're really just trying to procure for themselves a territorial state, as it were, that covers every nation on earth.
Remember the whole thing about democracy? This is just a democracy on an internationally conglomerated level, I would say.
Yeah.
So if Uruguay is having issues with Paraguay in South America, for those of you who are not geography buffs, you should learn that if you want to. The UN swoops in and say, "Hey, whoa, no, guys, we don't want you to be having these issues with Paraguay. You need to stop." And who takes a vote? Okay, then we will put sanctions on you, Uruguay, for all your nonsense.
And the only way sanctions actually work is because of the U.S. petrodollar, right? So the United States being a reserve currency is the only way sanctions work. And what we're seeing, to take it to modern times, what we're seeing now is the reduction of the viability of sanctions, because now Russia and BRICS nations are now getting together and saying, we're not going to use the dollar as a reserve currency anymore. We're going to do our own thing, right? And so now sanctions are literally going to mean nothing, especially in the UN. If you put sanctions, a bunch of countries get together and say, hey, we're not trading with this person ever, that might work a little. But then if they circumvent it through other countries, it doesn't really matter. It has no teeth,
right?
Is what we're going to come about.
What do you know about the civil war between the Reds and Whites?
In Russia?
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about? It was more of like communism and communism light, right? If you really want to break it down like that, it was like, who's the better communist, right? Is the way, like, that's really what it comes down to, is like, who's going to be in charge of the communist state, or who's going to be in charge of the state. This is what it was. The White Russians were technically more democratic leaning, and the Reds were more very hardcore Marxist communists, right? So the Whites could have been a better choice in terms of who controlled Russia, because, like I said, they had more democratic leanings. They were more for freedom of expression and so on, but still with socialist undertones and communist undertones as well. So there was still going to be some of that, but it would have been better than having Lenin and Stalin come into power. But the whole thing, anyway, Stalin wasn't ever supposed to come to power in the first place, right? Lenin didn't like Stalin. On his deathbed, he's like, make sure Stalin doesn't get power, and everybody that was already going to be his opponent was already dead. So there was no choice. It just went into his hands. So, but that's the thing with every communist state, though, is that they're always led by dictators at any point, because when you centralize power so much into one authority and there's only one party, that just breeds corruption regardless of what you do. The same thing was happening in California. They have a supermajority there. They don't have anybody telling them no, essentially. And so that's why we see the state that California is in now, right? But with the Cold War, the CIA funneled and disseminated money and weapons to all these different anti-communist factions throughout the entire time. So like the CIA was working to undermine all these different Soviet actions, but instead all they did was funnel basically start the war on drugs to begin with, then use the money from drug cartels in order to funnel weapons to these anti-Soviet parties throughout the Central America, South America, and elsewhere in the world. So the way that they paid for this money is by creating the drug trade itself, and hence why we have a problem today is because the CIA started the massive drug trade that we see. And so that's one of the reasons they'll never stop it, because it's too much of a cash cow in order to do covert operations and dark money through the cartels and everywhere else. You need money for these covert operations, and you can't get it from Congress. You have to get it from other sources. So that's one of the things. A couple of big points. One of them being the Bay of Pigs invasion during Kennedy's time, right? So that was Dulles again, who was responsible for that, and they failed the invasion because they were trying to take out Castro at the time. And this is right before the Soviets put the missiles in Cuba. So this is before the Cuban Missile Crisis,
right?
Which is a response to the invasion and the subsequent assassination attempt on Castro to begin with, right? But at the same time, we had nukes in Turkey, which is one of the reasons why the Soviets were so mad at us at the same time. So like during the Cold War, we kept doing this thing where we would escalate and they would escalate, and then it would keep going until we get to this point, and then they're like, okay, we need to de-escalate again. Right? Which is the same thing we're doing now in Ukraine, is that we're doing escalation and escalation, but everybody's saying, hey, maybe we should knock it off before this gets out of hand. Except there's no adults in the room. We have a puppet, Weekend at Bernie's, keeping him up, making sure that we're still going on this, even though nobody wants this, right?
Right.
A key point here, and this is going back to what Lee was saying about the advent of NATO too. Now you had mentioned the military-industrial complex becoming more of a mainstay, front-runner type organization. NATO became the implementation of a military presence wherever conflict was pending or about to happen or happening.
Right.
And because we were one of the main superpowers with military force, with this whole trying to denuclearize the globe, I don't think it was necessarily trying to take nukes away, but only give nukes to who they deemed worthy to carry nukes. Like we've been trying to take nukes away from Iran for how long now? And we don't want North Korea to have nukes.
Right.
But the last time I checked, the countries that are the most detrimental to world peace and detrimental to human lives are the ones who are now in possession of nukes. I kind of find that weird, but at the same time I don't, because it sounds exactly like the way Stalin wanted things to go. Which is why I think that the Cold War was more of, like I said, I think I'm leaning more to the fact that they were transitioning out of a single person having a single country having that control and say, and having a conglomeration of people that were better than them to have the say. How close do you think that is to truth?
I think it's pretty true. I mean, because you got to see how everybody's acting today and how they're keep trying to push more globalism, even though the world is contracting back into nationalism, right? So like they keep trying to, like, especially Davos and the
WEF, yeah.
Yeah, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, they're pushing globalism and like global governments basically through the UN, but they're not listening to what's happening in the countries themselves, you know, especially the United States being one of them, but they keep pushing it anyway. One of the ways that they're doing that right now is through, you know, environmental activism, right? ESG and all that nonsense, is that they're saying you have to comply with what we're pushing and those treaties, or else you're not going to be a viable partner for the future. You're not going to be a good
Right.
the word they go for now is stakeholder. You're not going to be a good stakeholder for the rest of us.
Now, we moved from World War II, where Germany was the bad guy, to them regaining their ability to have armaments in 51. I'm trying to figure out how, because again, you got to, you know, that I know that much happened. What I don't know is how they managed to accomplish that, having gone, it was just 6 years prior that, you know, there were some issues with them, and all of a sudden in 51 they can give them back there.
Well, that's because of how the Germany was split, right? So you have East and Western, Berlin being one of them, and then you also have the Soviets controlling half of Germany up until 1991. So, like, people tend to forget that Germany wasn't a state in and of itself until 1991. It was relatively recently that Germany became a power in and of itself. So up until that point, the U.S. and the Soviets had control of Germany
as a territory.
Until everything fell, and then now they're wanting us to leave Germany after we've already given our blood and treasure for their country to exist after the Second World War and kept them from being taken over by the Soviets, which is essentially what the fear was back in the days, that they were going to push. There was a quote which was that Stalin said at the end of the war is like, oh, hey, at least you made it to Berlin. And he basically retorted back, yeah, but, you know, the Tsar made it to Paris. So basically he didn't take enough. That was his point. And so I think that's what led to the fear in the U.S., especially in the European powers, is that they were trying to take more. And they like I said, that fighting point between the two states is who's controlling the world. Is it going to be the Soviets, or is it going to be the liberal economic order?
So, and this is a great segue into what's going to be coming the next slew of wars. So essentially, this is crazy. So essentially what they did was, and I think whoever was doing the research portion of nations understood this one vital point. In order for their regime to really take root, they have to get control of two things: any opposing forces and resources.
Yeah.
They got rid of the opposing force, which was the Soviet Union. And then they proceeded, once that was done in 91, to begin the next phase, and that's resource gathering. Because if you remember now, when Bush Sr. came in, he started making all types of treaties with other countries on behalf of China.
Yeah.
And on behalf of the UN and NATO and all these foreign entities that seemingly served American interests, but it never really served American interests in the slightest. We pass it off as, we need oil, or we need this resource, or we need that. We need to have this treaty. But none of the treaties that I could see really translated to American lives being enhanced by anything. Would that be considered then the, like Lee was saying, not just the military industrial complex taking over the American government, but the true beginnings of the American people being relegated to the back seat, and the American government taking over as the front runners?
Yeah, so this is what happened, is that the powers that be, the Bushes and all the others that come after this, basically just started extracting resources from the United States and selling it overseas, is what happened. So you took all these American jobs and the free trade agreements with China and shipped all the manufacturing and everything that made the US a power in and of itself to another country in order to get cheaper labor, to get cheaper cost of goods and all these other things. At least that's what we were told, right? It was for these cheap costs so we can have better things. But it really wasn't. It was an extraction of resources to China. We shot ourselves in the foot, because when we started taking out, like, you see the fall of Detroit and all the other manufacturing, it used to be in the early, pre-80s, you could have a blue collar job at a factory, make a decent living, buy a house, have kids, do all that stuff. And now you can't even do that. You can't even do that with any blue collar job, let alone a high tech job, right, in San Francisco, and buy a house and have kids. There are homeless people that make $100,000 in California. You know how insane that is?
Yeah, that's
like
crazy.
For that to be happening. So like that, what these people did is they won this. They won the Cold War. They won the right to be the rulers of the economic order, right? And what they did was just distract it for themselves. And then the American people lost out on that. So we lost our ability to keep ourselves sustained, self-sustainment, and sustainable infrastructure, for instance, in terms of factories, and we sent it overseas. And that's what happened to the middle class, is they gutted the middle class in order to line their pockets, is what it was. And that, like Marlon said, this is where it really begins the resource wars, right? Where we go into to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, all these places. So if you don't know, there's this thing called the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, right? The United States wanted to build a pipeline from Qatar through Turkey into Europe in order to give the Europeans cheap gas. But what that would do would cut out Russia from the gas market. And so the Nord Stream pipeline wouldn't work. So all those wars were about getting a pipeline through the Middle East to Europe. And that's why we fought those wars, was for that to happen. That's why Syria, after we went there and asked them, hey, would you let us build a pipeline through your land? They said, no, because Russia's an ally of ours. And so what happens? Magically, they have a civil war right after that. Magically, that happens. Libya said, hey, we're not going to use the reserve currency, the US dollar, anymore. Guess what happened to him?
Gaddafi.
We saw he died.
He died, yeah.
He died. Hillary Clinton, by the way, that's her quote.
The when Reagan implemented, or at least facilitated, the beginnings to the end of the Cold War, if you had to go on a limb and take a wild shot in the dark of how and why it happened under his regime, what would you venture to guess? And I call it a regime for a reason, guys. Listen why.
Yeah, Reagan. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I think because it was one of the first time, like, up until this point, like, it had been pretty dominated by the Democrats before Nixon came into power, right? So up until this point, pretty much from 1900 on up, it had been Democrat presidents, like no Republicans at all. Nixon comes in, Republican president, and he effed that up. So we got Jimmy Carter, right?
Best president ever.
Yeah. And then after Jimmy Carter, because Jimmy Carter basically shit the bed, in no better words, other than Joe Biden. So like you have Jimmy Carter and then Joe Biden as the worst presidents in the last, 50 years. I think like Reagan was a response to Jimmy Carter, just the way that Biden was a response to Donald Trump. That's the only reason he got in, is because he was popular, he was an actor. Same sort of reasons and rationale that Reagan got into power, I would say, and that he was a West Coast Republican. That was about it. He had connections, he had influence, he was a successful governor there. Really, now, that's what it was.
Here's my theory. I don't have any. Well, can't say I don't have any proof. I don't have any hard and fast statements saying that this is why him. The issues at the time within the American continent, and then more specifically the United States, was one of trying to make a bridge back again to the American people to make things a little bit more functional between them and the government, right? You couldn't pass it off with a normal politician.
Yep.
I don't think you could make it. So, like, if Carter had come up with this concept, it wouldn't have flown. People would have seen something ill about it, and they would have been. But Reagan, being a semi-outsider, even though he served as many terms as he did, he was still seen as a non-politician politician. Now, my theory on that is that in order to make the American people feel as though what happened was for our benefit, they had to have somebody that they can pass off to the American people as a face, while in the background prepping for the next phase by putting the first Bush in. They sold Bush on the idea that he was already in government, former, was it CIA or FBI or CIA, right?
Yeah,
I think he was CIA.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think he was CIA. Either way, former deep state, former, but current. They had to create a bridge to the people to appease their mind, and then bring in the back door the new regime of what was coming in form of the military-industrial complex. So with the advent of NATO, the UN, the dismantling of the USSR, and then the new political powers that we got and accomplished overseas that President Bush then brought in, you have now the perfect combination of American trust and political and geopolitical power on the world stage.
You're right. He was director of Central Intelligence.
Right.
For Ford.
Right. And he was also one of the men on the ground during the assassination of a certain individual.
Right.
Okay. Just throwing that out there in case people didn't realize what that was all about.
Yeah, the Bush family is very connected to a lot of nefarious things.
Yeah, them and the Clintons are running competition to see who has the most body bags. And Clinton's ahead. Let's not joke here. Clinton's ahead, like really ahead. They got nearly half of Haiti, so they had like
you could say the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and all the civilian deaths are responsible for it, so I'd say they probably have more in terms of overall body count.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see that.
So my theory is this, okay? The Cold War happened because it was a stalemate. Here's why I think it lasted as long as it was, and it wasn't a regular war, because they had been already trying to facilitate a transfer of power from the hated socialists to the accepted socialists. And they had to take their time doing it because it had to come in the form of policy, and it had to become in the form of power, and it had to come in the form of military. And they had to all work together in tandem to make this actually pass off as something good.
Yeah. And
well, I would even.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, even from a social standpoint, back in I think it was after World War II, the Frankfurt School decided to seep its way into the United States education system, teaching the soft socialism into the DNA stream of United States culture, to the point where we're at now today is this whole weird sort of neo communism type deal.
Here, I'll piggyback off that. So here's the question: was McCarthy right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was McCarthyism worried about communism? Right. And I would say, looking at how things are now, yes, he was absolutely right, because the Soviets were running a campaign in order to subvert the U.S. by indoctrinating and politicizing educators in colleges back in the 70s, right, in order to convert them to communism in order to spread the message. And now we have exactly what McCarthy was afraid of, right? And now we have communists everywhere, openly everywhere, talking about subverting the U.S. and dismantling the Constitution on a daily basis. Right. So, like, I would say he was right, because they were, in fact, in Hollywood. They were, in fact, in the institutions, in government. They were everywhere. And so that's what we're dealing with now, is that the Soviets won the long game, even though they're long dead, right? So it took a while, but they won that war, and now we're having to deal with the death throes of what they left us behind. And so that's what the U.S. is dealing with now, is we're dealing with the remnants of Soviet propaganda in the United States. In order
I think
to
you're
make,
also seeing the revamping of it.
yeah,
We're seeing it and like I said before, this mindset, this I don't think the USSR ever died. They transitioned from localized to global. But you
yeah,
could not accomplish that if you had not taken the time to get all the countries involved to a space where they would all be pushing the same agenda.
yeah,
And now you're seeing the fruition of it, where they are now blatant enough to go into other countries that have no need of the UN, no want of the UN, no funding from the World Bank, to tell them how they should and shouldn't run their sovereign nation. The same way they tried to go into the USSR to tell them how they should and shouldn't run because, oh, we hate coming. But meanwhile, you're taking all of their standards and putting it into practice within the confines of the UN.
yeah.
And something else that hit me was this: you mentioned that they were infiltrating Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
There were a select few actors and actresses that did not kowtow to the communist regime. And I don't think that Reagan necessarily did that in his first term. However, there was a marked difference between him at the beginning and him at the end. If you go back and look, he stopped speaking up about certain things on the latter half of his presidency. And I have to wonder if there was how do I say this without sounding like I'm a conspiracy theorist, even though I am. I think there was a transition in what he was trying to push to what he had to push at the end of his presidency in order to make this transition from him to Bush happen, which I don't know. Honestly, I don't believe that Bush won the election. Just hear me out. I don't think he won that election at all. The same thing with the second Bush. I don't think that ever happened. And I think that's why you never really saw a fight. The last time you saw a fight was with Romney and Obama, right?
Yep.
And I don't think that was even a real issue. But I digress. I think when you saw Reagan become president, you saw a transition out of the political realm for people and saying we're bringing the American populace back into the voting system.
Mm-hmm.
They brought them back in only to just remove them again later.
Yeah.
Because now you don't really have a voice anymore, but you never really did have a voice because all it did was give you the illusion of the voice.
There's Ron Paul said this recently on another podcast that he believes that the U.S. was subverted with a coup when Kennedy was assassinated, right? So Kennedy being the last person that was freely elected, almost, right? So we look at how the deep state is operated, or not the deep state, but the administrative state, right? Nobody gets in that they don't want to get in until Trump happened, and you saw how they reacted once he got in. He wasn't supposed to get in.
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't his turn. They have people lined up who they want in. It's just we have Marlon said, we have the illusion of choice of who gets elected the presidency. Like, you might have your local elections; those count. Your votes count for those. But when it comes to the federal elections up in the higher echelons, like the presidency, vice president, those are not chosen by you. Those are chosen by specific people that only let them in. And if they don't like it, they'll change the rules to make it so that other people get locked out. So look what they did to Bernie Sanders, for instance.
Yeah.
Great example of that. They will change the rules. Same thing with any independents. They will change the rules of how many things you have to be in order to get on the stage, in order to debate. They will always change the rules to fit what they want. Same thing with mail-in voting and ballots and all this other stuff. They will always change the rules. Legally, mind you, they will legally cheat. There's a difference. They will play the rules that they just made for themselves. So if it's like trying to play somebody with Monopoly that has a fake money printer underneath the table that keeps taking every time they're losing, that's exactly what they're doing. It's like, okay, now this rule's been implemented. What, you can't change the rules in the middle of the game? Well,
Sure
I did.
can.
So what are you going to do about it? It's legal. They don't need to cheat. They just change the rules. That's it.
Now, I have a theory, just a little tributary here. The reason I
Mm.
think they had to negate Bernie's role in this, because they love Bernie. I'm going to be honest. They love Bernie. Bernie, his ideas are exactly what they want, but he's too out there with it.
No.
He doesn't make it very palpable. He doesn't make it sellable. He doesn't sell communism correctly. Bernie
Yeah.
is way too brash with it, way too obvious with it. You have to be very subvertive with your messaging. And I think that's why they had to remove Bernie, because he would have ended up showing them, the American people, I mean, exactly the plan. And inadvertently, albeit he wouldn't have known that he was doing that, because he doesn't care, because he really does love socialism. I mean, way back in the day when he went to hang out with Castro and all them, he's a real piece of work when it comes to communism. But they
Yeah.
couldn't afford to have him running that loudly with it. They were trying to do just a little bit of a whistle, not a foghorn. And Bernie was a foghorn. They needed someone like Hillary or another Democrat that was a little bit more subdued in their way. And if you watched,
A
the
fake martyr.
candidates for the presidency on the Republican side were the exact same as the ones on the Democrat side. There were no differences between them. They didn't push anything different in their policies. Trump really was the only one that came out with something completely other. To your point, Coy, of them saying, no, 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 no. He's going to throw a wrench in what we're trying to do. He's going to slow the process down. Now, if you look back at the history of the wars we've been talking about, you will see a pattern, a very slow, methodical pattern to get rid of what America was founded as into something what you see now, an amalgamation, if you want, of every socialistic regime ever to grace the earth, from Korea at the initial onset, China, um, the first and the tail end of the UK, Russia, the USS, all of them have facets to socialism and communism that they all seem to implement, oddly enough, in the UN right now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
So the things that we're facing now is all of our own making, and it has been in the making this entire time. So one of the points I was going to bring up earlier, I forgot about, was the fact that the only reason the war in Ukraine is happening right now is at the end of the Soviet Union, we told Ukraine, hey, why don't you give up your nukes? We'll protect you. Don't worry about it. We'll do that for you. If they would have kept them, there wouldn't be an invasion in Ukraine right now. But we convinced them to let go of their nukes.
Well, I think they
that.
did that in order to implement the kind of leaders they wanted there too.
Yeah, and that's really what this war comes about, is that at the end of the Soviet Union, we said, hey, we're not going to expand NATO, and then we kept expanding and expanding and expanding until we were on the doorstep. And so, like, you kind of pushed them into a corner there with that. And then the 2014 ousting of the pro-Russian president in that coup was another reason that led up, like, all the things that we've done. Same thing in Afghanistan. We helped the Mujahideen oust the Soviets from Afghanistan, which ended up being a safe haven for the Taliban, which led to Osama bin Laden and 9/11. Is essentially that what it comes down to, is that these things have always been because we did them to ourselves throughout the entire time.
Now, every time. So with now, I know people may think we didn't touch on the Cold. We have been completely touching on the Cold War, because the Cold War was our transition point from World War II, hate, to a stalemate, prepping to what will eventually become the military industrial complex, to what is now the resource wars. Yeah. Now, the resource wars will take us a full week to cover. And I mean that in every meaning of the word. For all three of our shows, it will take us that long to break apart the real reasons we have been dabbling and dipping into people's places of conflict in order to secure for ourselves, and oddly enough, NATO and the UN resources in order to continue what their plan is. If you guys have any questions, and you can go back and watch all the wars and see the progression of the United States from our advent, and how every time we stepped in, we got one step closer to where we are now.
Yeah.
Like unequivocally, we kept getting closer. So next week, when we tackle this concept of the resource wars, I think more and more you'll start seeing, and someone said the word, you'll start seeing the heads of the deep state become more and more clear to you. And I don't mean individuals. I mean nation states that are deep state, because this is more than just we see an internal deep state here. That's obvious. You have a couple of big players in the deep state here. But then you go up a little bit, and then you have organizations of the deep state in the United States. And then you go above that, and then you have people of the deep state globally. And then you go above that, then you have umbrella corporations that are of the deep state. So what we're going to end up breaking apart with all of this is, does it really apply that America is the problem? Or is it the people that are involved in the larger corporation part of the UN deep state that affects American policies? And we see it as just what we're distracted with. Oh, Hillary's bad. We know she is. We understand that. But is she just a pawn in the larger game that the world stage is playing? And that's the kind of stuff we're going to cover in all of the wars stemming from 1993, 94, all the way up to, well, now, World War III. Because I have a suspicion World War III, you'll see a mixture of the Cold War and World War II.
And just mind you, remember, and I think the audience should be privy to the idea that this does not help us at all. None of these wars from 1812 on has actually helped the American citizen. It's all been a massive cash grab and a resource grab that leaves us normies out in the dust. So when we're going into these resource wars next, it's not going to be for your benefit, American. Like, by your, I mean you, the American citizen, the average everyday Joe Schmo. So
prep yourself for that. Hopefully, bro said he'll be back Sunday night, so I think he'll be available for the show on Monday. Cool. Do your research on all of these wars that we've entered since the end of the Cold War. If you do yourself a favor, start looking into them. Every Middle Eastern war, even proxy wars from those wars, diplomats we've sent into war zones. Check out all of them, and you'll start seeing a very interesting pattern emerging before you that we'll try and break out as much as we can before we get deleted from Facebook and YouTube. But we'll do what we can once we start exposing stuff, and we will talk about that too, Melinda, the sacrificial side of war, and who they send in and who they don't send in, and what their plan is to get rid of the I would call them the patriotic string of Americans. If you can send the most patriotic ones out in the front line, you have less back home to fight the cause when we start taking over. I'm not telling you it's crazy. It's crazy. So starting next week, we're just going to have, like I said, we're going to have one blanket title for the week, which is the resource wars. And it's going to be broken up in part 1, 2, and 3. And we'll go through it from the very beginning to now. And we'll be getting into a lot of the current issues that are facing not just America, but countries that are considered second and third world. Any parting comments, Mr. Coy?
Not really. I mean, you just have to look at what's going on. Like, everything that people do is for a reason. They do it for greed and personal gain. It's always going to be personal gain. And a lot of these people are families involved in a global scale. They're the global families that you know about and you've heard about. Like, a lot of these things are tied together. You look at who's on boards of what, who's getting money from where, and who's involved in the trade. A lot of these things tie back to every single family you've ever thought of in terms of who's getting payments for all these war. It's like, it's not for your benefit. None of this has been for your benefit. It's always these leaders deciding that this is what they need to have done in order to line their own pockets. It's always been about money, regardless of what you think. It's like they can say all pretty words and things. I've got a couple books that'll tell you how to win an election, right? Just promise everything, but once you get into office, just say, oh, I can't do that right now, and obfuscate whatever's happening. It doesn't matter what it is. Just say, I promise this, and then never deliver on it. Because then if you deliver on your promises, then you don't get an election.
You
don't
don't.
win.
Exactly. So tune in next week. We'll be kicking that resource and final section of the wars off. And then we can start dabbling a few more times into current events. But I think it was vital that we as a group, Savage Patriots, cover everything from the institution of the Americans to currently, because if you don't understand that, today ain't gonna make much sense. And you're gonna just be going kind of shooting blind. So do not forget, like everything we've done so far, share it. And coming this week, we're gonna have one of the, I think, more of the more important shows with regards to the future generation that you'll ever see on probably YouTube. There are not many people tackling the stuff that we're tackling from the root out, because I think we need to start listening to why we're here. Otherwise, we'll just keep repeating it as a nation going forward. Lee, please take us out, sir.
So y'all just need to like, share, comment, subscribe, and this is the Savage Patriots signing off.
Peace.